During vanilla, Blizzard built the biggest map for World of Warcraft ever, spanning 2 entire continents and more than 3 dozen zones. It truly was a world to explore. The sheer size of Azeroth and the unknown of what was around the next corner was one of those things that made the game so interesting all those years ago. Sometimes you find a hidden enemy camp, sometimes a new quest hub, and sometimes you take the gate in Northern Redridge into Burning Steppes and get a fast track ticket back to the graveyard. Seeing a new environment, a cave in the distance, or the ever ominous skull level enemy were things that were exciting and kept you wanting more out of the game. But even with the size of the game and how much was planned, Blizzard still had to scrap or delay plenty of ideas. They wanted to do more things than time would allow them to, and eventually certain ideas were packed up and moved into expansions instead of major patches. Today I'm going to be taking a look back at a bunch more of the early ideas of vanilla that never made it into the base game, exploring what they could have been, and hopefully uncovering some more of the unfinished parts of classic WoW. In Silverpine Forest, Horde players experience a story of a city that has been saved at the cost of unleashing horrors upon the world. I've been playing through this zone recently with the text-to-speech add-on called VoiceOver, and there is a lot more to it than I thought there was in the past. And Silverpine creates so many stories that are picked up in future expansions, such as Archmage Aragal's resurrection in Wrath of the Lich King, and of course the Worgen race and Gilneas becoming official content during the Cataclysm. The once great city of Gilneas itself is situated in southern Silverpine, and was a big point of mystery during vanilla. It was one of those big gates to nowhere that teased the later content in the game. Outside the gate, Alliance refugees camped in a sense of hope that one day the gates would reopen, whilst Horde players had to contend with the disastrous decision of Archmage Aragal to summon the Worgen into the world. And during nighttime, the residents of the nearby Pywood village morph into their true form. This is one of 2 areas in the game, that I know of at least, where there are different enemies between night and day, the other one being the graveyard in Moonbrook in Westfall, where there are vultures in the day and zombies at night. As for Archmage Aragal himself, he has retreated into the depths of Shadowfang Keep, asserting himself as the Worgen Alpha and commanding his forces from afar. And during Classic, I feel as though the Horde see near enough their entire side of the story to its conclusion, that being finally defeating Archmage Aragal himself inside of Shadowfang Keep, but Gilneas and the various Alliance outposts serve as mainly cannon fodder for Horde quests, rather than anything actually linked to the Alliance's story within the world. Later, the Greymane Wall would be shattered by the Cataclysm, revealing the nature of the more humane Worgen to the world, as well as Gilneas. In Classic, the continuation of this story could really go either way. You could have the Worgen regaining their sanity and returning as a race to the Alliance, or you find that Gilneas has been overrun by feral Worgen and has to be cleared as PvE content. Or maybe even Gilneas is something similar to open world city content, such as Suramar was during Legion. There are many different ways this story could go than how it went in Cataclysm, and I know it's all just speculation and stuff that sounds cool on paper, but that's what makes it interesting to me. If there is another big door teasing future content, it's the Colossal Gateway in Ashara surrounded by Firbolg. Except unlike the Greymane Wall, this gate remains a mystery to this day. We talked about Ashara a bunch in the previous video, and how there is a certain lack of content to be found there. It's a near enough endgame zone that feels as though it's been forgotten about in favour of more compelling stories in other zones. And if you check the classic map of Ashara, these Firbolg gates have even been officially drawn up onto it. It really all suggests that this place was meant to be something more than what it ended up being. There is even a rare mob that can spawn called Gatekeeper Rage Roar just outside of the gates too. On top of that, the gates themselves go directly into the side of a mountain, almost suggesting that the Firbolg are living under the mountain, kind of like dwarves would. And well, if you look at Timbermoor Hold on the Felwood side, we do in fact have a faction of Firbolg occupying the underground, where they've carved out a pathway between Felwood, Winterspring and Moonglade. Now there is something else which I've noticed here. The subzone that the Firbolg live in Felwood is called Timbermoor Hold, and if you stand in front of the gates in Ashara, you also get a subzone called Timbermoor Hold. So if we link the dots and use, well, a lot of imagination, we can only assume that the Firbolg have a massive underground empire that goes all the way from Felwood to Ashara, and that these gates were due to be the entrance to it, but it just never got finished and put in the game. Another point to consider here is that the player can become friendly with the Timbermoor Firbolg, who have managed to escape corruption, unlike the other Firbolg tribes that we encounter. So maybe it could even be quite a similar situation to Gilneas. Maybe the gates reopen and the Firbolg somehow, some way become an ally of the Horde. I mean, it's in Ashara, that's quite close to Horde territories, and I'm just saying in Cataclysm, the idea that goblins would fully pledge themselves to one faction never quite made sense to me. Alternatively, the Firbolg have shut off the gates for the good of Azeroth, as Timbermoor Hold had fallen to corruption, and they did not want to unleash the horrors that have been growing there. And in that case, we could have it cleared as PvE content with raids or instances. Either way, we never found out what was behind this set of gates, so it would be cool to see it one day. Next is a feature that was cut from a Horde race in vanilla, and would kind of make a return to an Alliance one in Cataclysm. Plains running. Originally, this ability was what Tauren got instead of a Kodo mount. I guess Blizzard were thinking, how can we find a mount large enough to make sense for the Tauren model, which is fair enough. There were 2 NPCs where you could learn this race-specific skill. The quest text from CERN Pride Runner is still available on Wowhead's database, saying that you will be granted the swiftness of plains running. The other place where you could learn this skill was from a female Tauren that wanders Stranglethorn Vale, called Samantha Swifthoof. You've probably seen her on your journeys throughout this zone, and as Alliance, though she does show aggressive, she will not attack on sight, unlike other enemies. Just don't go hitting her for no reason unless you want a PvP flag. The first version of plains running was seen to be problematic though. While standard mounts took 3 seconds to summon, plains running took 10 to ramp up, and if you stopped or entered combat it would instantly fade, leading to this cool idea actually being very frustrating. These limitations were considered in the first place for PvP reasons. I mean, can you imagine a Tauren running circles around people at 100% speed once they gain the level 60 version of plains running? Because that could have been a very hilarious reality. Also, you could not turn plains running off. Once you hit that 10 seconds of running, your cow just entered nitro mode and started sprinting off into the distance, or maybe into a pack of enemies, or maybe off a cliff. Yeah, it had 1 or 2 problems. During the Cataclysm, of course, Worgen got running wild, with a blue post at the time even referencing plains running. Running wild, however, just worked like a standard mount, having a cast time and increasing your movement speed by a set amount. I don't see why the idea for how running wild functioned couldn't work for plains running nowadays. I mean, I certainly want to see Tauren randomly sprinting across the world. Another project that was seen very early in vanilla was the Dragon Isles. For a name that's been known for as long as it has, it's amazing that it finally was brought to life in World of Warcraft's most recent expansion, Dragonflight. Originally, the Dragon Isles were intended to be a late-game zone in the northern eastern kingdoms. There was also supposed to be raid content present for players between levels 65 to 70. This zone and/or raid was also supposed to house temples of worships for various old gods that would serve as enemies for players. One of the most popular early pieces of concept artwork shows a fossil or squid-like temple with long tendrils extending outwards. During the battle for Azeroth, the Shrine of the Storm in Stormsong Valley showed very similar artwork to this idea, but just on a much larger scale. And as easy as it is to miss, this kind of artwork itself was included in Classic WoW too. Well, when I say it's easy to miss, it is if you play Horde, because it's located in Darkshore. There is a subzone called the Master's Glaive, which show off the remains of a huge and ancient battle between an Old One and stone giants. Players are sent there to find out what the Twilight's Hammer are up to and to put a stop to them. This quest series eventually carries players over to Black Fathoms Deep to defeat more powerful cultists. The Dragon Isles were cut at such an early stage of vanilla that these days, if they were brought back, they could really be anything. Also, we already have a fight with one old god, Cthulhu, during vanilla, but maybe we do have space for a second. The next one I have is something that I'm sure nearly everyone's going to know about, but one that I'd like to include in in the video, because there was a lot of work put into this area despite it not seeing some form of release as a raid until TBC, and later as a full zone in Cataclysm. I am of course talking about Mount Hyjal. This subzone had quite a bit of design work in place already, and you can visit it in game in Classic, either through a set of tricky jumps or just spam Eagle Eye on a hunter. That's much easier. It's overall quite a linear zone, with one major path leading from the instance portal up the mountain. There are a number of blank open spaces that have been laid out as foundations for content, and perhaps biggest of all was the world tree showing Archimonde's defeat following the battle for Mount Hyjal. There is also physically an instance portal for Mount Hyjal in the game too, and that's located deep within Dark Whisper Gorge, but you can see the iconic swirly green entrance, suggesting that this zone would have been for a raid, but we have a gate just in front of it blocking access. Hyjal is a zone that we have seen plenty of after vanilla, and I'm just gonna say I could happily skip the raid version in TBC in favour of it being a full-on zone in Cataclysm. I could see it being a zone in Classic though, for sure. As for what PvE content may fit in here, I feel as though you'd have to come up with something kind of new from what we already have. Archimonde has long been defeated in terms of the story of vanilla World of Warcraft, so really the options would be open here. Next up, one of the most captivating stories told in World of Warcraft is that of the Ashbringer, but you really have to dig deep to find much reference to it in the game. Players fortunate enough to get hold of the corrupted Ashbringer from the Four Horsemen encounter during Vanilla Classic can take it over to the Scarlet Monastery to trigger a special event where Scarlet Crusaders no longer are aggressive. They believe the player is the return of the Ashbringer into the fold. After a rather violent interaction between the Scarlet Commander and High Lord Mograine, the player is able to speak with a redeemed High Inquisitor Fairbanks, who perhaps gives out the most interesting information of this event. He says that the corrupted Ashbringer is beyond redemption, but there is another son of Mograine to be found in the Outland who has the capability to forge a totally new one. This is of course referring to Darien Mograine. However, in the story of World of Warcraft, what Fairbanks says just doesn't happen at all. Instead, Darien briefly joins the Scourge before breaking away after the Lich King's betrayal at the Battle for Light's Hope during the DK starter quest, and he just keeps using the corrupted Ashbringer instead of trying to forge a new one too. I think a lot of people want the idea of some kind of Scarlet Crusade raid or instance. This conversation with Fairbanks could serve as the start of something entirely new. Imagine it is a new late game raid after Naxxramas. You start off by finding the corrupted Ashbringer from Nax, you have to find Darien Mograine out in the world somewhere, though you may have to change the text about him being an outland a little bit. You forge a new Ashbringer as part of the raid, and what would be a more fitting legendary to add into Classic than a reforged Ashbringer? I mean, you could even get the unused Quell for Last Zone and the Sunwell involved in its reforging too. There is just a ton of lore and story built up in this area that would make sense for vanilla. Again, I'm just throwing out ideas, but there is so much grounds for great content here. Next is a zone where there is a big difference between the two factions, the Hinterlands. Now, if you are a Horde player, you probably really like this zone, and I can't blame you because there is a lot to get done here, elite quests, and many great quest rewards that will last you till level cap. On the Alliance, yeah, there's not quite so much going on, which is strange because there is a full-on Alliance faction that calls this zone their home, the Wildhammer Dwarves. In Classic, this is a faction that you can grind all the way to Exalted if you really want to through repeating quests and grinding mobs. It is, well, completely useless though. Seriously, this may be the biggest waste of time faction to get Exalted with. Not only do they not have a reputation vendor, but this faction also gets removed from the game at the start of the Burning Crusade, because, well, it just didn't serve any purpose. The Wildhammer Dwarves will later be brought back during the Cataclysm as a faction to appear in one of the new zones, the Twilight Highlands. It just feels as though there could be something more here than there currently is. Could there be more faction-based quests? Maybe a reputation vendor that sells mount-related items possibly. Also, the Wildhammer are famous for their ability to fly griffins. Now, I'm not suggesting flying, or even faction-specific flying, can you imagine that? But maybe there are ways you can improve the flight network, improve the speed of it, something like that. There is also a PvP sub-story in the hinterlands too, though it is mainly a horde thing, where you're preying on various alliance forces such as high elves and griffins throughout the zone. That's another thing we could talk about. High elves, they are allied with the alliance despite only playing minor roles in the game as a whole. Anyways, there is this one-sided PvP thing going on, not sure how much could be added to it, because in terms of open world PvP objectives, they've been done in both Eastern Plaguelands and Silithus, and they have a tendency to be rather dead content due to the rewards not being there in terms of honor, gear, gold, and so on. The next one I have is a curious little cave entrance that I think most of us would have seen. Located just to the west of the Searing Gorge side entrance to Blackrock Mountain is a small blocked off cave entrance. The reason you'll have seen this quest entrance is probably when you're doing that one quest where you have to kill greater lava spiders. Now this cave is maybe just nothing more than a bit of scenery, or perhaps at some point it was meant to be something larger. The cave perhaps was a link down to the Altar of Storms on the Burning Steps side of Blackrock Mountain. The Altar of Storms itself is very rarely visited, apart from players looking out for Black Lotus in the game, and in the lore they used to be places of great power for the Horde. Biggest of all is that this mysterious small cave even has a name, Blackchar Cave. It feels like something was supposed to be here, but it was scrapped. All the same, I do kind of like having to go through Blackrock Mountain as the main way to travel on foot between Searing Gorge and Burning Steps, so these days this cave is probably just a bit of scenery. Next is a bit of content that feels as though it could have a bit more done with it, and that's regarding the Centaur reputations in Desolace. So if you're a reputation enjoyer, you will know that during Classic it's possible to just about get revered through grinding mobs, then turning in quests with either the Gelkis or Magrant Centaur. In BFA there were changes added so the player can now hit Exalted to open up more reputations for the 100 Exalted Reps achievement, but in Classic you only get a couple of extra quests after having hit the higher reputation thresholds. What about getting a reputation vendor added with new things the player could get? There's already plenty of choices in professions for picking one or the other, such as Gnomish or Goblin Engineering, Armor or Weaponsmithing, and so on. What if this was extended to the player picking Magram or Gelkis Centaur as a part of your character progression? You get ammo from one of the quest rewards. Maybe you could have one of the best tiers of ammos being behind Exalted with one of these factions, for example. Or maybe you could add some hunter pet food that reduces the damage taken from AoE, so your pet isn't completely useless in raids. Again, just some ideas. Next is a small island which is super easy to miss. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you've walked past it a dozen times and never really noticed it. It's called Purgation Isle just off the coast of Hillsbrad near South Shore, and I'm kind of surprised this didn't end up being cut. Prior to patch 1.10 it was just a bunch of level 20 to 30 mobs occupying the zone, despite there being no quests here. Alongside of the release of the tier 0.5 quests in 1.10, the isle was updated to now include very high-level elite mobs. Even still, the only reason to go there was to farm Soul Ash as part of your tier 0.5 quest. During Kata, this isle was overhauled again and made into a small quest area. Perhaps in Classic, Purgation Isle could be used for more than what it is at the moment, maybe as a higher level questing area, or a possible place for new items or profession patterns to drop. But there are several other islands that were present in early versions of Vanilla that did not make it into the live game, such as Gilligim's Isle or the Isle of Dr. Lapidus. Both of these places were allegedly supposed to be points of interest for questing or leveling players, however they were both cut at some point in time. I think island-based content can be super interesting, and they make for a good natural break between regular questing and having that feeling as though you're going into a more dangerous zone. Perhaps the best example of this to me that did make it into the game is Alcaz Island. This place ends up being a part of the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline and the home of a mini-boss, Dr. Weevil. Also, Varian Rin himself was held there prior to patch 1.9. He was located in a lower sewer area before being later replaced by a generic named mob. Maybe you could even bring back the storyline to free the king from the Defias forces in Dustwallow as part of an alternative narrative. I think if you can say one thing about all this scrapped or cut content is that there's a rather common theme of them being eventually used during the Cataclysm, and though Cataclysm as an expansion ended up being quite divisive among players, I feel as though it did build upon a lot of the ideas presented in early vanilla, and could certainly, in parts at least, be used for inspiration if Classic Plus or anything along that line would ever happen. In any event, there is a metric ton of story and potential in Classic that lays beneath the surface. And I know this whole thing is a dream and probably very unlikely, but I want to imagine a game where one day it's possible and we do get to see a whole other side of World of Warcraft. For the longest time in World of Warcraft, raiding has been a huge part of the game. The research that goes into your class, preparing your gems, your enchants, looking up your bis, learning your rotation, and of course checking out boss mechanics so you aren't the guy who doesn't understand why they've wiped the raid 4 times in a row. A lot of effort goes into raiding from a lot of people. But for one version of World of Warcraft, the raids themselves were, not the most challenging, shall we say. In fact, looking back now, we can see the bosses were more or less different sized target dummies that distributed nice purple items. But the tough bit wasn't taking on the bosses necessarily, it was getting to the raid in one piece. This is why Classic Vanilla was the game where getting into the raid alive was harder than the actual raids themselves. Now, in any other WoW expansion ever, it really doesn't matter if you have a little mishap with gravity on the way to the raid or get in some PvP, other than your raid leader asking what you're doing, of course, because at the end of the day, you get there, you buff up, you eat up, you flask up, and you're good to go. What happened 5 minutes ago isn't going to affect your entire raid night performance. In Vanilla Classic, this was not the case. In fact, ensuring you did get to raid alive was absolutely critical to your performance. Imagine this being the case in any other expansion. There were no flying mounts, and if you died for any reason on your way to raid, literally any reason at all, you don't get heroism and bloodlust for the whole evening. This is kind of similar to how it was back then. And you better believe there were people who, on each and every server, made it their life's work to ensure that getting to raid alive was going to be as hard as possible. Why was dying such a big deal then? It's pretty simple. There were these things called world buffs. I go over them all in this video and the lengths you had to go to collect them all. More or less though, you had to travel around the whole of Azeroth gathering these buffs from various, often open world, sources. They would give massive boosts to your performance, such as Songflower Serenade giving 5% extra crit chance and some more stats, or Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer for 10% spell crit, 5% physical crit, and a nice chunk of attack power too. There were a bunch more of them as well, and they all stacked, meaning a player who would put effort into their buffs pre-raid was, depending on your class, upwards of 40% more powerful than they would have been without these buffs. In terms of DPS, healing, or even bonus health for tanking, world buffs were a very big deal. They also put a gigantic target on your back saying, hey, I've just spent a bunch of my time collecting these buffs, it sure would be a shame if I were to die and lose them all before I can get into raid. It was very much like a game of cat and mouse, the guys collecting buffs trying to hide away and stay out of sight, and the hunters looking out for players with the buffs just to take them away so they didn't do as well in raid that evening. Oh, and some of the world buffs were magical effects too, so you didn't even have to die to lose them. You could have a level 20 something priest or whatever level it is you learn Dispel Magic run up to you, spamming that ability, and you lose a buff that could have increased your crit by 5%, which of course meant you needed to load up on trash buffs to protect the good ones. Even though Dispel Magic was random, of course, you could still get unlucky. For example, as a warlock, I had Water Breathing, Detect Invisibility, Shadow Ward, Demon Armor, and then you can load up on cheap combat scrolls. Oh, and one more thing worth mentioning. Obviously, this was only really a problem on PvP servers. On PvE servers, you kinda just go and get your buffs whenever, and then you run into raid, dolo, whenever. But let me tell you, I played on a PvP server for the majority of Classic, and I would never even dream of attempting to get into a raid by myself. I might as well have just taken my world buffs and thrown them down the drain, because the team effort in Classic for raiding didn't start when the raid began, it started a good while before that. Getting into raid clean was a guild and raid-wide effort, and the more populated your server, or the more skewed faction-wise your server was, the harder that objective became. So, you're level 60, you've been farming your consumes, your prebis, raid night is finally here. You've gone and collected all your world buffs, and it's now time to put all that preparation to the test. It's time to raid, which means it's time to get into Molten Core. Located at the bottom of Blackrock Mountain, this is the first big target to get into alive, and we do have several options to get in and several factors that are going to make this tough to do. On the positive side, there are two separate entrances into Blackrock Mountain from the north or the south, meaning your raid can fly to Siren Gorge or Burning Steps and then run over. Your raid also has the choice of doing the lava jump all the way down from the northern entrance. This is fast, but often a little bit more risky. People can mess up the jump, and you don't always know who is going to be waiting down at the bottom for you once you're in the lava. The other choice is following the huge chain all the way down. This one is done way less, but if you know there's a raid group at the bottom, you can position much better against them instead of throwing yourself into lava where you can be slowed and rooted. What makes this raid hard to get to is that either entrance into the mountain is a narrow corridor, and whilst you do kind of all have to run in together, narrow corridors can very much be death traps. It takes one mage to catch your raid off guard via invisibility potions and trinketing into a Frost Nova and Sapper to lead to a chain of events. We can lose half your raid. 3 or 4 mages could legitimately wipe out a stacked raid of 40 people in about 2 or 3 globals. Mages were pretty good back then. Also inside Blackrock Mountain, you cannot mount back in vanilla, so it's not only that we don't have flying mounts, you just don't have any mounts at all here, and trying to run ahead with speed boost or sprint isn't going to do you much good either. It's just going to get you caught out of position a lot sooner. It's worth bringing up that there is counterplay to getting engaged on there, which was super important that you prepare in advance too, and organize when you're going to be using them. First up, we have 3 action potions, or more commonly abbreviated to FAPs, as we like to call them. These, when combined with other items, ensured that any class in the game could be CC immune and have a mini sprint effect too. FAP into Nifty was a big call out to push forwards for your raid. After that, it's just hoping you have the numbers over the other people, and usually more mages that tends to help, which as an organised 40-man raid you tended to do. If you were particularly worried about getting AoE down, you could also pre-pop various protection potions such as Fire, Arcane and so on. There was something for all the various elements. These all lasted 1 hour in Classic for some reason, and they stacked. You could log in, pop a potion, log out for the 2-minute cooldown timer, relog and do it again to ensure you had all the protection against all schools of magic. There were also limited invulnerability potions or lips, which were really powerful. These are what mages would use when they blink into groups aggressively to Nova and would protect you from all physical attacks for a short duration. On top of that, you could still act, cast and melee whilst under this effect. You also may think, would everybody be carrying a PvP trinket? Well, you would if you could, but in early Classic, the PvP trinket didn't exist yet. It released alongside Blackwing Lure in Phase 2 when the honor and ranking system dropped, so you had to look for other options. For Blackrock Mountain, scouting was key, and a lot of people had second accounts in Classic for summoners or to play the opposite factions on PvP servers and so on. So it tended to be the case where you had people hidden somewhere in the mountain, or rogues that were stealthed, scouting and calling out enemy positions. Very thematic RPG stuff, to be honest. It's also worth mentioning we had layering. It was a little more rudimentary back then, but you could force swap layers onto a different one to avoid raid-wide PvP encounters. Kinda lame, but a lot of people opted into doing that. The northern entrance was most used for Molten Core in my experience, as the short drop into the lava left you right next to the door, meaning it was easy to FAP and get inside before you had any problems. Also, the window next to the NPC that teleports you into Molten Core is actually a portal into the instance. It's not really clearly marked out, but it is. So if you dropped off the ledge angle from the upper pathway correctly, or swam beneath it, you would get teleported inside. This was a really safe play to make and was probably the best way to get inside the instance, since if people wanted to chase you, they had to follow you into the lava and their choice would be to swim around the side to escape or go in the instance themselves. But eventually we had Blackwing Lure release, also inside Blackrock Mountain. The entrance, once you've completed the achievement that is, was an orb at the far end of the hallway where the instance to the portal to Blackrock Spire is located. This one could be even more problematic to get to than Molten Core, simply because the route which you had to take were, you guessed it, narrow corridors. There were, however, two main ways to get up there as well, either the entrance on the eastern side of the mountain or up from the chain on the northern side of the mountain. You could also hop inside Blackrock Spire if you got separated from your group and try to rejoin later. I saved my buffs several times doing this. Oh, and in case you're wondering why not just summon people, you couldn't do that in Classic because, I don't know, you couldn't. Your locks would have to go outside if they wanted to summon you. Also, each summon costs 1 soul shard. Once you got inside the main hallway where the orb was, unleashing your FAP and Nifty and just rushing whoever was at the end nearly always won the battle on a pure numbers basis. Once you get stuck in mage AoE, you just kinda win very fast. That was as long as there wasn't so many of you piled on top of the orb that it was impossible to click. You know how there was a portal next to Molten Core as an option to get inside? I don't know why they didn't do that again here. Release night of Blackwing Lure was a total disaster back when I was playing on Gehennas. Turns out clicking a small orb to teleport inside is kinda hard when there's about 100 people on top of it, and that's without going over the fact that Blackrock Mountain with over 1,000 people in it kinda just didn't work. Phase 1 also had a Nixia too, of course, though if I'm honest, you tended to do this one at the end of the raid night, where buffs had already timed out by themselves, or maybe people had died with them. Also, actually trying to DPS on this fight could be a grief since Onyxia messes with threat all the time. I swear I spent half my Onyxia fight sitting at the back and wanding, because I didn't want my Shadow Bolt to crit and instantly shoot me up to near the top of threat. The true classic Warlock experience. Anyways, getting in here could be a bit of a pain, mainly because the res run on both factions put you miles away from the entrance, meaning you get a nice few minutes on the way back to enjoy the scenery. Thanks for that, Blizz. I also want to do a quick mention for Zul'Gurub as well. Throughout my entire time playing on a PvP server, I never even once went to Zul'Gurub the intended way. I guess it was in part to keep buffs, but even if I didn't have buffs, I ended up still using this route. You see, back then, Alliance didn't have a flight path in northern Stranglethorn Vale. The closest flight path to ZG was either Duskwood or Westfall, which are, well, not very close, are they? But there was another way, which was A, much faster, and B, much safer. And this was through some creative use of game mechanics in Duskwood. I went and tried to see if this skip still works in Wrath, and yep, can confirm that it does, after quite a bit of remembering how it works, that is. This gets you into an unloaded version of Zul'Gurub that still exists in the open world, but doesn't have all the elites and enemies in it, meaning you can run over from where Jindo the Hexer usually is, straight through the instance portal and then be inside the raid. Even with me failing the jump for about 2 minutes when practicing, I still think this would be faster than the alternatives for Alliance. But in time, the next major raid tier would release. After the war effort had been completed and the Scepter of the Shifting Sands assembled, AQ40 officially opened. Now, whilst Blackrock Mountain had its issues with the narrow corridors and no mounts, AQ40 presented its own set of problems. The primary one was that it was located in the absolute middle of nowhere, as far south as you could possibly get in Silithus. Now, in comparison, Blackrock Mountain for Alliance was right next to Stormwind, so you could just fly to a zone nearby, and Horde could set their half to Kargath and go for a short ride. No one really had an easy time getting to AQ. You could set your Hearth in Cenarian hold, and running was definitely an option. The problem was world buffs, surprisingly. All that time running was time lost on your buffs, and whilst you kinda had to run into Blackrock Mountain, AQ40 had more options. There were two main problems to overcome. First, the main gateway that was open during the war effort, which created a natural choke point, and the second was the stairs leading up to the raid on the left-hand side. It was a one-way uphill battle with several pillars where people could be hiding behind, and in my experience there were always people waiting outside, either looking for PvP, waiting for their raid, or just having gotten used to being the majority faction on the server. This led to players finding creative spots around the entrance, and trust me, there were a lot of them. Whether it was jumping out of bounds and then climbing around a wall, or finding a way to get stuck inside a wall, people did anything to create a spot where they could summon their raid team safely. I've seen entire 40-man raids just randomly run out of a wall next to the entrance of AQ40 before. During Classic, the spot I was most familiar with was just up the ledge towards where the big bend in the stairs is. In fact, it was often the case that more than one guild would be summoning at the same time, so you would all join forces as as 80 or 120 people and rush the gates of AQ. Most of the time it worked, sometimes you got left behind, but that was one of the best options for getting into the raid alive. The final big tier of Classic was of course Naxxramas, where world buffs were more important than ever. Having a full set of buffs could be the difference between a clean kill and the beginning of a wipe fiesta. Similar to AQ40, Nax was kind of in the middle of nowhere again. Flight locations weren't too bad from Undercity or Ironforge, but Light's Hope Chapel as the nearest flight point was still a good ride away from the raid. On the upside, the benefits Nax had was the area around it was incredibly open, more so than any raid tier beforehand, which created a number of approaches which guilds could take. In fact, you could even get in solo relatively safely with invisibility potions. The problem was, again, your world buffs are ticking down. Each second you're playing safe is a second off your buff timers. So much like AQ40, people resorted to finding safe summoning spots instead, and whilst there were no walls to hide in next to the entrance, there were mushrooms. And these mushrooms, through a bit of experimentation and slow falling, could be climbed on top of. I went on RAF servers to see if I could recreate one of the summoning spots, and I managed to get it, though Nax 40 isn't there anymore, of course. Kel'Thuzad flew it on over to Northrend or something, but it used to be just below the shroom. This was a relatively safe space to summon your raid, and then have everyone bring noggin foggers to proc the slow fall effect, or have some other way to avoid fall damage while getting into the raid itself. Or alternatively, you could get below the Naxxramas entrance portal too. This was done through clipping the walls via changing your model size to something smaller, like with the winter event that turns your character into a gnome, and Nax released in winter fortunately enough, and then using blind or fear that would cause your character to path unpredictably, sometimes even through the floor. You could then get summoned there and just jump up to get through the portal. Pretty nifty. I'm sure there are plenty more safe spots and tactics people use for going into raids during Classic. The lengths people went to save their world buffs were pretty big, and if I'm being honest, some of the best times I had on Classic playing a PvP server was actually just going to raid, not the raid itself. The moment when you're rolling out as a group of 40 players, knowing full well you could come under attack by another huge group at any moment. There was a risk present as well, your buffs, and a meaningful risk at that. This is what made it memorable as opposed to regular world PvP where there's practically no risk. Sometimes you just get sent to the graveyard and you run back. You die with world buffs, your performance for the entire raid is rip before you even step foot inside. Yet, as cool as it sounds with the huge scale PvP, the rogue scouting, the safe spotting, it got old eventually. Well, for me it did. I ended up transferring off of a PvP server to PvE towards the end of Classic, for the simple reason that I got tired of playing cat and mouse every single raid night. It had been over 1 year of playing super careful and trying to keep my buffs. With Naxxramas coming out, I decided this is it. This is the final tier of Classic. I don't want to have to deal with this anymore. I want to be able to perform as well as I can without all the messing about getting into the raid. After the transfer, I will say it felt a bit weird just being able to run up to a raid and go inside, as if something was missing. But looking back, getting into the raid and PvP servers certainly had their upsides and their downsides. I guess that's what makes them memorable. I think what I can say for sure is there comes a point in games when most people want to experience the content for themselves and not be the content for other players. Giving someone else direct impact over your actions in a gaming world where it's been designed to be played for fun and in your free time is an inherently risky thing. So as fun as the getting to raid experience was at the beginning, let me just end with this. The mice would never ask for there to be more cats, but the cats will always very loudly protest the opposite. It's January 3rd, 2006. World of Warcraft's latest patch has just dropped, 1.9, The Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. You hear it comes with a whole new raid over in the desolate and forlorn zone of Silithus. So eagerly you set about it, gathering your buffs and consumables with 39 of your most elite guildies in tow to give those bugs a firm slapping and to collect some perps. Only to get there and find, well, you can't get in. It's locked. Well, there has to be some kind of attunement then. We've had those before. Molten Core had one. You needed to go run through Blackrock Depths and touch a stone outside the instance. Blackwing Lure had one too, and that was pretty fast. You just loot the Quartermaster NPC outside for the letter, and then you can use the teleporter. This one should be pretty fast too, right? As it turns out, there was quite a bit more to this one. Little did players know at the time, but the task that Blizzard had set them to enter AQ 20 and 40 was without a doubt the largest collaborative server-wide event that's ever been introduced to World of Warcraft. And that remains true to this day. It would be the catalyst for so many server-defining moments, and for memories that would stick with people long after their subscription lapsed. This is a story of sweat, griefing, and drama. This is the opening of the gates of Ahn'Qiraj in World of Warcraft. So then, this whole opening the gates stuff, what do we actually need to do here? Well, in essence, it's pretty simple. We need two things to happen. First of all is the war effort must be completed. This is a shopping list of items to end all shopping lists of items. It's a collection of materials that represent the raw cost of setting up Azeroth's combined forces to go up against the minions of an old god. After the war effort is completed, there's a grace period that lasts a couple of days where the materials are transported to the desert, after which the second thing that needs to happen comes in, and that is for a player to have assembled the Scepter of the Shifting Sands and to bang the Scarab Gong outside the creatively named Scarab Wall. This would unlock the gate for the first time in many years, unleashing ancient horrors upon Azeroth. This was called the 10-hour war, or probably more accurately the 10-hour server stress test. This was true both in vanilla and classic. This was 10 hours of chaos as the defenders, or attackers maybe, of AQ flocked out the freshly opened gate upon the denizens of Azeroth. Simple enough so far, but what do you get from all this? Well, it was no small undertaking. Trust me, when we get into a bit more detail on what this whole opening the gates actually needs, you'll see what I mean. Anyways, rewards. Well, for the war effort, as you handed in materials, you got boxes that gave random greens and a bit of reputation with your faction capital. Anyone could contribute to this, however, from a level 10 handing in some Peace Bloom to a 60 doing a stack of thorium ore. This part was never really about the rewards. What was, however, was the Scepter of the Shifting Sands and banging the gong. This extremely lengthy and unique quest had some amazing epic item rewards, unique cooking recipes, special boss fights, and roleplay events. There was the eternal glory of being the guy on your server who opened the raid. Oh, and there's also this mount you get too, the Black Battle Tank. It's one of the mounts from inside AQ40, but it works outside, and it's black. Nice. The title wasn't available in vanilla. You weren't officially a Scarab Lord until the launch of TBC, when Blizzard added it in. So there's your little introduction to the event. That's what we need to get done, and that's what you get from it. Now for how it really all went down. Let's cover off the war effort first, or the shopping list. Each faction on every single server had a collection of items that had to be turned in before someone was eligible to bang the gong and start off the war. Even if you had assembled a scepter in 24 hours, it meant nothing if the war effort had not been completed. This made it arguably even more of a priority, not only due to the volume of items needed, but also because there was a grace period between you completing the war effort and someone being eligible to sound the gong over in Silithus. Some servers, both in vanilla and classic, simply didn't have the population to realistically be able to gather all of these items, and went months without being able to access the new raid. In time, Blizzard would add an auto-complete feature that would contribute a certain percentage of items needed every single day, and eventually they'd go on to give people the helping hand they needed and full on set the event to done. Also, there were several realms at the time which were in an awkward position of, whilst being very large, they were only very large on one faction. So if there were 10,000 active Horde players and 100 Alliance players, well, the Horde would go and have to do the war effort for the Alliance. This did happen on a number of realms, which people did through trading through the neutral auction houses and transferring characters with gold to those realms, though I suspect a few less legitimate ways of securing gold were used too here. As for how many items you actually needed, I did a bit of maths on the numbers, and for example, the Alliance needed a total of 2,443,000 individual items, including 90,000 copper bars, 400,000 runecloth bandages, 110,000 medium leather, and 600,000 silk bandages. The Horde had to gather, quite literally, 1 million less items than the Alliance, clocking in at some 1,408,000 items needed in total. This was because Horde had a number of higher quality items that had to be gathered, so it evened out a bit. I'm only joking, of course. The real reason is that Blizzard loves the Horde and wanted it to be easier for them. What started to become noticeable with this event was that each server was a little bit different, and this is something which will very much carry forward when we get around to assembling the Scepter. In fact, each server would go on to have its own story to tell. At the time, I was on Gehennas in EU, which was without a doubt one of the most try-hard servers on the region. We had a lot of the big guilds who had played alternative servers in the past, shall we say, and were more than just prepared for the day to come when the war effort would begin. The Alliance finished the contribution in a matter of days. The Horde side contributed to the war effort by, well, not really doing anything. It wasn't like the Horde was a low population on the server at the time either, they just didn't turn in their items. Why was that? Well, it could have been a number of reasons. They didn't want to feel as though they were helping the Alliance by completing the war effort. Maybe it was to get back at big guilds on the opposite faction, who they knew they could hold back where they couldn't beat them in open world PvP, or maybe it was just to buy some more time. And sometimes you did need extra time, because whilst the other faction might be done, your guild still might be working on your scepter or scepters. And it was like a game of chicken, because after the gong is rung, everyone with a scepter needs to go bang it as well in order to be eligible to get the mount reward. If you miss this 10-hour timing window, well, that is unfortunate, because now you have a scepter in your bank to look at with zero opportunity to ever redeem it. And no, you couldn't just transfer to another server and ring their gong instead. Blizzard put a hefty 90-day restriction on any gong banging after you transferred, which was a good bit of foresight there. Imagine having someone come out of the blue, ring your gong, AFK for 3 months, and then transfer back. This very much made it into a race and a test of trust between both factions. Remember, in the game, this was a collaborative server-wide event. Is someone going to jump the gun and ring the gong early, or can we hold off until everyone assigned to get one is done? This meant the easiest way to ensure no one did bang it early was just to sit on war effort supplies for as long as you needed to, and a lot of people did that, which would of course in turn make people rather mad, because they wanted to do the raid. So they would organise raids themselves to go gank people farming for the scepter, they would grief their events, or even use a spam report feature to trigger bans. It didn't exactly help people finish their scepter any faster, in fact it did the complete opposite, but hey, I guess it got back at them for not playing the game in the way that other people wanted. How dare you not be handing in your peace bloom? Do it now. So that is the war effort, and in some ways that was the easy bit. Now we need a scepter of the shifting sands. Picture this quest for a moment. It must be done to unlock the new raid. It's near impossible to solo and requires a lot of help, or a lot of gold. Each server creates its own time gating for the quest, and it offers rewards only literally a handful of people would see. Everyone wanted to do it. 99.9% of people wouldn't even get past the first part of the quest. There's been many server-wide events in the past. The Isle of Quel'Danas progress depended on server-wide dailies done. Many pre-patch events such as Legion or Dragonflight brought people together, but none of them were even close to the levels of insanity that the Scepter of the Shifting Sands required. Back in original vanilla, the player Galahad from US realm Medivh was the first reported Scarab Lord and the first person to ring the gong. On Blizzard's official 1.9 patch trailer, players from that realm were also accredited with this achievement. What's truly remarkable is that given the efforts players had to go through, and considering the patch launch was on January 2nd, 2006, is that the first gong was rung some 20 days later, on January 22nd, on the previously mentioned realm Medivh. World 2nd was reported from US realm Manaroth on January 27th, and World 3rd from European realm Kael'thas on January 30th. 20 days from zero knowledge of the event to completion, that would be pretty decent timing by today's standards, but nowhere near fast. Of course, today in Classic, players knew exactly what they needed down to the last Peace Bloom. They had summoning networks set up in advance to get their Scarab Lords around the world, and truces and cross-faction pacts were established in anticipation of the event. If you didn't already know you were a Scarab Lord 6 months before the event happened, you just weren't gonna be one. Where in vanilla, a server may have seen 2 or maybe 3 Scarab Lords, in Classic, well, things were different. We had layering for a start. This meant that several different different versions of Silithus coexisted alongside each other, which is vital for farming reputation, as we will soon see. Some servers' factions coexisted and farmed well alongside one another. US realm Fairbanks reported out of 55 people that signed up to go for Scarab Lord, 49 of them were successful, but the realm with the most Scarab Lords by far and away was the Russian server Flamegore, which reported an unreal 90 Scarab Lords completed in total. Not quite as rare of an achievement as it used to be. As for speed of completion, where in vanilla it took 20 days, in classic on the US realm Sulfuras, the entire war effort and scepter were completed in a staggering 14 hours. That's some 3.8 million items handed in between both factions, and the entire Scepter questline done within that space of time. Players would have had mailboxes with thousands of pages of items waiting for them in this remarkable feat of preparation. This was done primarily by members of the guild Grizzly, though this won't be the last we will hear of them during this event. Now, I'm not going to cover every single part of the Scepter quest because there's 32 in total, but in essence there's a reputation farm portion of the quest, and then you need to go and find 3 Scepter shards that are held by the green, red, and blue dragonflies. First, we should do a rep farm. This is kind of the filter quest. It was like saying, if you can't do this, just don't bother with the rest of it. What you needed to do was go from hated to neutral with the brood of Nozdormu, and there's actually a cool reason you start at hated too. Being a bronze dragon, Nozdormu saw the future and knew you only pre-ordered the base edition of Dragonflight instead of the epic one, and that made him rather mad. Anyways, hated to neutral is 42k rep, same as neutral to exalted actually, and there was one repeatable way to gain reputation, and that was to complete the quest, the Path of the Righteous. This had you hand in 200 Silithid carapace fragments in exchange for 500 reputation, so we're talking 84 hand-ins total, which doesn't sound too bad, does it? Well, that's until you realize 84 hand-ins means you are required to farm 16,800 Silithid carapace fragments. However, each completion of the quest meant you received an item which would allow allies to also collect these fragments, so the more people you can have working alongside you, the faster you can get one person to neutral, and you really could only work on one person at a time, as in there would be potentially dozens of people that would be farming bugs in small groups spread out across Silithus, then go and trade those fragments to the dedicated player who would then hand them in for the reputation. So I've mentioned these Silithid carapace fragments a few times now. What's up with them? I mean, it's simple enough. There's 3 hives located across Silithus. They're full of elite bugs. You go kill them, you go loot them, you get the fragments. The elites can drop up to 4. First team to 16,800 fragments gets to progress on the next part of the quest. Now, this grind in of itself was pretty lengthy, but could be done in a day or two with enough dedication and help, but that wasn't necessarily what made it difficult. What made it hard was the fact that each person who wanted to create a scepter needed 16,800 fragments, and each person would have teams fighting over bug spawns, and in Classic we have this a little thing called PvP servers. So if you wanted to put a group together and just gank endlessly, well, you could. This is where the preparation work that people had agreed on before the event began to show, and it was also where it became clear who had got in with the right crowd and who was going to be pushed out of being able to farm enough fragments. And unlike original vanilla, so much of the politics were not handled in-game. The advent of Discord allowed players cross-faction to quickly and efficiently communicate between one another. Which guilds are allowed to farm? Which hive will they occupy? How long are they expected to be there? And which players and/or guilds do we not like? Who do we need to watch out for and make sure they can't farm or disrupt other guilds? At this point, the notions of in-game factions were no longer important for the farm. There were those whose names were on the nice list and those who were on the naughty list, and that was kind of it. Cross-faction collusion was more rampant during the Scarab Lord farm days than it ever has been since, and people were not happy about it. How can your own faction sit by and watch as your chain mind controlled or polymorphed, which in Classic could last over 30 seconds by the way, because good old Classic class balancing? It was unacceptable and against the spirit of the game, some would say. There was even an old terms of service page dug up where it said in blue, clear as day, that it was against the rules to communicate directly with players who are playing characters aligned with the opposite faction. And it wasn't an uncommon sight to see everyone just running past one another. The goal in mind was farming fragments, not PvPing. Though I will say the areas between the hives were like running across a minefield. The amount of players bloodthirsty for some world PvP action were massive, and any stragglers would be quickly dispatched. In the end, Blizzard, yeah, actually they just didn't do anything about it. Players colluded between factions and players met their goals, and all was harmonious on Azeroth, or as long as it had to be during the reputation farming, because that was only the beginning of the journey to obtain a scepter. The next part would see relations break down on many servers, as previously established truces had outlived their usefulness, and it only took a few people to bring a whole event to a standstill. On to the shards then. So the red and blue shards weren't actually too bad to get. The red was by far the easiest. You just do a run of Blackwing Lair in under 5 hours. That's literally it. Yeah, not exactly much of a tall order there. The blue had a huge quest line within the quest attached to it, where you had to use a magical fishing bait to attract a shark-like creature called the Wrath of Neptulon. This quest featured defeating open world bosses, invading opposite faction capital, and was the source of World of Warcraft's only epic cooking recipe, Dirge's Kickin' Chimmerok Chops. It also rewarded the Band of Icy Depths, which is the highest value vendor item in the game. Very cool. The problem in many cases was the green shard. There were several issues with this part of the quest. Not only did it involve trying to defeat a boss in the open world that needed a raid to be done, meaning the opposite faction could come and try to AoE you down whilst you were in combat, your own faction could also grief you too. An NPC required for the quest, Keeper Remulos, was part of the Cenarian Circle, a faction which if you wanted, you could toggle as at war with, meaning at any point during the quest, he could get tagged and pulled out of the quest zone, causing it to reset. Or when you were trying to hand the quest in, you could tag him and just run him around in circle for hours, and you had to get somebody from the opposite faction to come and stop this from happening. Things got so bad with griefing on this step of the quest, Blizzard eventually had to step in and make some changes to prevent certain underhand tactics that players were coming up with. But you could also grief for this quest at another point, and this would set the stage for arguably the best storyline from this event, and you couldn't have scripted something better than this. So, as another part of the Green Shard quest, you had to go defeat a Twilight Corruptor in Duskwood. This required a decent sized raid, and it was an open world boss, meaning it's extremely easy to grief attempts. On US server Sulfurus, relations had grown poor between factions and guilds that had colluded efforts to farm materials and to grind fragments in Silithus. Alliance Guild Grizzly, remember them, first to complete war effort in only 14 hours, had started to cause problems on the Green Shard part of the quest, holding down the world boss area in Duskwood and preventing any other guilds from being able to advance. Eventually, some reported 200 Horde players combined together and pushed them out of the zone, aiming to score a quick kill on the Twilight Corruptor and advance the quest chain. However, the moment the Horde moved in to pull, the player running for the Scarab Lord on their side received a ban. It came out of nowhere, but almost immediately everyone knew that something was wrong. It appeared as though members of the Alliance had all falsely reported this player at the same time, causing some kind of automated response and for him to receive a suspension the moment it looked like they were finally able to kill the boss. Soon after, a post went up on the classic WoW subreddit, gaining a huge amount of interest for the Sulfurus drama. Not long after, Blizzard replied, saying, "After reviewing the accounts in question, we can confirm the actions did not happen as a result of abuse of the reporting system. While investigating the accounts involved, we did discover evidence of some players who were attempting to file false reports with bad intent and have actioned those accounts for abuse of game systems." Which to this day, I still don't understand what it's supposed to say. So they weren't abusing the report system, they were just filing false reports. I don't know, sounds like abusing the report system to me. Anyways, the prospective Scarab Lord was unbanned not long after, meaning they got to continue progressing the quest line. A shared Discord conversation between Horde Guild Amnesty and an ally from Grizzly said it all. The Horde will retaliate. I know how this ends. You do too. And the retaliation was swift. Soon after, the gong sounded in the deserts of Silithus on Sulfurus for the first time, starting the 10-hour war, and more importantly, a timer. Anyone who had the scepter had to bang the gong too if they wanted their mount and later their title. However, some of the players on the Alliance were yet to turn in all 3 shards at Anachronos in Tanaris. This had to be done to actually get the scepter to complete the quest, and if you remember how this quest line started off, you did a reputation grind from hated to neutral, which meant for the vast majority of the server, this dragon is hostile. What can you do with hostile units? You can keep them in combat forever so they cannot be interacted with. This was the Horde's revenge for the report ban. Some 1,000 Horde players flooded the zone of Tanaris, holding down the choke into the valley where Anachronos resided and kept him in combat for 10 hours straight. Despite the Alliance numbering in the hundreds, they never broke through, and though the 10-hour war raged in Silithus on US realm Sulfuras, it was fought in Tanaris, and it was a victory for the Horde. And that is how the guild that contributed the most towards the world first war event missed out on many Scarab Lord mounts and titles. Then again, should the Horde and Alliance ever have worked together in the first place to farm fragments in Silithus? What about the players who hadn't done anything wrong and just needed to hand in during the 10-hour war? Did they deserve to lose their mounts too? You just don't get this in other games, do you? Each and every server will have their own story around the war effort, their own drama, the betrayals, the politics. Classic was certainly rough around the edges, but did it ever create stories and characters? It's reasons like this why we can look back and realize this game is nearly 20 years old and people keep coming back to it. Raiding in classic World of Warcraft so far has been, for the most part, fairly straightforward. Especially among top players, it's a totally different game from retail WoW. The Race to World First is a huge event for dozens of players, putting in hundreds of pulls on some of the most tightly tuned bosses Blizzard has recently cooked up. For us over in Classic, it's more of a surprise if the bosses make it past the first hour, never mind the first reset. And despite the chasm between the two, there will always be the player who wants to go the extra mile, get every ounce of performance possible out of their class, and be, as they would say, a Giga Chad pumper. Today I want to cover the most interesting ways players have taken advantage of in-game mechanics, stacked buffs, and found new ways to interact with items and so on in order to get that extra bit of performance out of their character. There is a lot of variation from different methods in terms of putting a number on what the actual DPS benefit would be. For some it's a tiny difference, for others it's upwards of 30%. Easily. Right then, we have to start somewhere, and it's gonna be Feral Druids. There's something about this spec which attracts people who are just built different. From day one of Classic, there's always been some weird way to optimize performance of this particular class and spec. In fact, this is more or less the Feral Druid part of the video. They have the most class-specific optimizations that I can think of. Now, Feral Druids, despite equipping weapons, don't actually attack with those weapons. They're clawing away as a cat or mauling as a bear, and that meant in Classic and TBC your weapon was more or less a stat stick, as melee weapons are to hunters. Also, you couldn't proc some of the BIS enchants like Crusader or Mongoose and had to use agility instead. These all seem like very negative things, but it gave rise to a level 29 weapon from Gnomeregan becoming the best item you could equip for the entire expansion. Yes, throughout all of Classic there was nothing better. It was replaced in TBC eventually due to raw stats outpacing it, but in Classic as a feral, if you really wanted to perform, you had to go and farm manual crowd pummelers. This was about a 1 in 3 drop from an optional boss in Noma called Crowd Pummeler 960, who you can get to in a few minutes from the back door of the instance. What makes it so good is the on-use effect. Since your weapon is just raw stats, the fact you could add 50% attack speed for 30 seconds was a buff that nothing else in the game could match, meaning to really push performance, you kinda had to go and farm these. And oh boy, did you have to farm a lot of them. You see the tooltip where it says 3 charges? Each 1 in 3 drop from a level 29 boss gave you 90 seconds of God mode, and then you needed to go farm another and another and another. Oh, and dungeons would lock you out after 5 resets within 1 hour. Goes without saying, but a reset took less than 12 minutes. This was best in slot for Bear and Cat, by the way, both benefited hugely from the increased attack speed. Out of everything we go over today, this would have probably been the most time consuming to do, and it didn't make you top DPS either, like not even remotely close to what warriors were capable of doing. But that is not all Cats had to do. In addition to your level 29 weapon, you also had a level level 40 helm that was BIS forever, the Wolf Head's Helm. This was used for the majority of TBC as well, though I believe at some point raw stats on items did overtake it. Wolf's Head Helm was used to perform something called power shifting. Now, back in Classic and TBC, energy regenerated at a rate of 20 per 2 seconds, not as a constant bar filling up like it's in Wrath and, well, every single expansion beyond that. And as you can see on this helm, it grants 20 energy when shifting into Cat. Over in the talent tree, what if we combine this with the Fura talent, which gave a further 40 energy when entering Cat form? Well, that's 60 energy for leaving and re-entering Cat. If you time this correctly with the energy tick, that would give you a further 20, and you went from near an empty energy bar to a nearly full one in the matter of about 1 second. This technique simply gave you more energy to use on Shred than you could possibly achieve just waiting for your bar to fill up normally. It was, however, very mana intensive to maintain, meaning druids went through many more mana potions and dark rune than your average DPS would. And no, it still didn't make you top DPS either. But wait, there's more on feral druids. After having spent many nights in Gnomeregan farming weapons and wearing a level 40 helm in TBC, Blizzard had one more curveball for you. In patch 2.2, changes were made to regeneration effects in World of Warcraft to try and make them more consistent across the board. Under the old tick-based system, sometimes using a spell on the moment when the tick occurred would cause you to partially use the benefit of some of that spell, such as Innovate or Evocation, not actually giving their full duration. A change was made so instead of the tick happening globally, it now happened on a player-by-player basis, and also very importantly, any change a player made to their personal tick timer would reset it, as well as then refunding any resources that would have been lost due to the change in the timer. Okay, you still with me here? So essentially, instead of you being able to power shift, gaining 20 energy from your Wolf's Head Helm, 40 from Fura, and then another 20 a moment later from the global tick, it was now the case where you were shifting into Cat. That was a change in your energy regeneration and the timer reset, meaning you were sitting there for about a full 2 seconds waiting for your energy tick. This made your rotation much slower than it used to be. Enter Weak Troll's Blood Potion. This level 8 consumable gave you a minor amount of health regen. Using and cancelling this effect at the start of a power shift would make the game consider a change in your regeneration rate, and would therefore restore some resources which have been lost in the change, such as energy. So druids would have to shift into Cat form, drink a Weak Troll's Blood Potion, cancel the buff within about a 0.5 second window by the way, cast Shred, the energy tick happens, cast second Shred, and then power shift again and chug another potion. This means that druids were going through one potion every 4 seconds in order to match what power shifting was able to do previously. Or if we take a 3-minute fight as an example, a feral druid would go through 45 potions. And this was just to be back in middle of the pack DPS, by the way. It's been a roller coaster for feral mains, I'll say that much. Enough about druids though, because I have loads of other things I want to cover. Because you can't talk about min-maxing buffs without at least giving a throwback to world buffs in Classic. We're going to go all the way from the fairly easy ones to the I don't know how people put up with these ones. Spirit of Zandalar I would say was the easiest to get by far. You go and hand in the Heart of Hakara at Yojamba Isle, and about 30 seconds later the Spirit of Zandalar buff goes out for every player on the isle as well as in Booty Bay, and you can see it gives a pretty huge chunk of stats, though definitely much better for physical classes. Best of all, there was no cooldown on handing this in bar a short bit of roleplay, and it was undispellable, nice and easy. And at one point, somehow, someway, the Spirit of Zandalar buff was added to the player's spellbook with no global cooldown. You could literally run around spamming the buff for others and it would grant it to everyone in your zone. It was pretty hilarious, unintended, and of course it got fixed. Next, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. It was layer specific. This got changed to across all layers later on in Classic. But for a lot of Classic, you had to be on the correct layer for the buff. This buff was given out after handing in the Head of Nefarian or Onyxia in Stormwind or Orgrimmar. This conferred a huge buff to all players in the affected area, whatever level they were. Yes, you could get this on a level 1. Yes, it made leveling insane. Now, the problem was, apart from having to be on the correct layer, was that the quest hand-in had a 6-hour cooldown independent of each hand-in. And sometimes as a guild you want to buff, but hey, it's still on a 4-hour cooldown. That's a problem. What do we do about that? Well, you had to reset the quest NPC. This meant getting a member, usually a priest of the opposing faction to come and mind control the quest NPC so you can then take them out, because when they respawn in a few minutes you could do another hand in. Unless you had that one guy that kept killing the mind controller and stopping literally hundreds of people from getting the buff, which definitely happened by the way. Now we have the Diamor North buffs, or more commonly known as the tribute buffs. So this was a little more complicated to get. A tribute run is completing Diamor North whilst keeping many of the bosses alive. At the end of the run, when you defeat King Gordok, you're declared the new King of Diamor, and you can run back through the instance and talk to the bosses which you left alive for their tribute. And for most of the bosses, this tribute was a buff that you can see on the screen here. Yes, all of these stack too, by the way. Now, this is where the problems begin. See, clearing Diamor North takes time, and if you have your other world buffs running already, you just, well, don't have time to do that. Fortunately, however, hunters would commonly clear Diamor North solo as a gold farm, and then they could sell the cleared ID to somebody else. But you still had to get to Diamor, which is in the absolute middle of nowhere. So people would buy summons to get to the instance. Players would have several accounts with summoning networks set up to get people inside the instance, sometimes inside the actual instance portal, to mitigate the risk of getting ganked. Oh, and just to mention it as well, Diamor North buffs are magical, so they can be dispelled, meaning now you don't have to worry about dying and losing buffs. Now it's any priest, shaman, or any other magical dispel can remove your efforts. And we aren't done yet. In fact, we're very far from done. Next, you need another summon to get to Felwood for your Songflower buff. So this buff comes as part of a quest chain in Felwood, where eventually you can cleanse several of the plants around the zones for buffs such as food, or in this case a whole bunch of crit and stats. Now each plant had an individual 25-minute cooldown, depending on layer of course, and any person who used it would start that cooldown. However, I'm not sure whether it was thanks to our good friend spell batching or if everybody just spammed it at the same time, but if everyone clicked it the moment it came up, everybody would be able to pick up the buff around it. Oh, but in case you thought this was getting too easy, this buff only lasts 1 hour and it's magic dispellable. Gotta be careful. Our next step can be the easiest or by far the most difficult. We need to go to the Darkmoon Fair. This event is only available once per month for 1 week, rotating between Elwyn Forest outside Stormwind or Morgor outside of Thunder Bluff. Of course, even on PvP servers, both of these zones are not contested, meaning as an Alliance player in Elwyn, I can very safely stroll out of Stormwind and pick up my buff, no problem. Oh, and by the way, the buff is just 10% more flat damage after you pick some certain options from Soothsayer Sage, so it's pretty massive. The hard part comes in when you have to go to the other factions fair, because they know people will be coming to the zone and they are going to be force flanked on PvP servers, whilst they will not be, meaning people would actively defend the buff from the opposing faction. Creative workarounds such as invisibility potions and having someone in your group join a battleground were used to make picking up this buff consistent, as when your battleground queue pops, you can use a weak aura to instantly accept the correct options from Sage, then join the battleground and leave, and you'll be ported to wherever that person joined the battleground from. So all in all, it was very much doable. And we aren't done yet either. The final buff we need to pick up was relatively easy for the Horde and nightmare fuel for the Alliance. However, I will say it's essentially a melee only buff, which made me happy that I chose Warlock because I did not have to deal with picking this up personally. I'm of course talking about Warchief's Blessing. The bit you care about on this buff is the 15% melee haste for 1 hour, which is an absolute enormous amount. Okay, so prepare yourself for what we need to do to pick this one up. On Horde, there is a quest to kill Rend Blackhand in Upper Black Rock Spire as part of their Onyxia attunement called For the Horde, i.e. you can only do this once per character, meaning you have to try and actively monitor players around the appropriate level and whisper them asking if they're going to be handing in. I remember getting whispers on my shaman anytime I went near Thrall. After you hand in, a mere 8 seconds later the buff will drop in Orgrimmar, and about 17 seconds later will also drop in the Crossroads. The roleplay on many of the other hand-ins gave you plenty of time, a good 30 seconds or so to get logged in whenever the buff was called, but with Warchief's Blessing you kinda already had to be logged in and waiting. And at this point in time, since it's a 1 hour buff, you're going to have other buffs running too, so you don't want to be logged in for too long either. Also, the buff going out has a 3 hour cooldown and you can't reset it because, well, it's Thrall himself who gives out the buff. You can't exactly walk into Orgrimmar and mind control a Warchief. Now, the thing about this buff is it was faction specific. Only Horde players can get it. Or can they? What if Alliance players did a little bit of changing of factions at the moment when the buff was granted? Well, in fact, they could. Back in Classic, when you got mind controlled by a member of the opposing faction, you would change to their faction for its duration. This was changed in TBC at some point. Now, if you've been following what I've been going on about, you'll notice that Warchief's Blessing only drops in Orgrimmar or the Crossroads, which as an Alliance player aren't exactly places which you want to be, meaning you would have to get summoned somewhere that often used creative game mechanics to get to. After getting summoned, you find out in Discord when the buff drops. You don't want to be logged in too early, but after you log in, you need to then get mind controlled, get the buff, drop the mind control, and then port out to Stormwind and hide somewhere because you'll be flagged for PvP and you still could get dispelled. And now you're ready to raid. It's just that easy. Oh, and keep in mind with all these buffs, you can easily hit the buff cap. Yes, there is a buff cap, by the way, which is 32. This meant, for example, using heals over time on a druid was quite literally griefing your raid because a rejuvenation could knock off Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, leading to a very angry DPS player. But I think you get the idea with world buffs. They were certainly something. Actually, there were a couple more buffs you could get if you really wanted to go all out. In fact, there were a lot more than this. I'll cover a couple of the more interesting ones though. You'll probably remember Diamond Flask. This was a really unique trinket that only warriors could get as part of their class questline. It gave a bunch of strength as well as a small amount of healing over its duration. Now, there were two things on this quest which may not be immediately obvious. First of all, if you didn't pick this item as a quest reward, ouch, that is all I can say, because for some unknown reason the healing it granted scaled with the amount of bonus healing power that the warrior had equipped at the time on a 1-to-1 ratio, and it snapshotted that value. This means warriors would actually have a full-on bonus healing set with enchanted weapons, trinkets and everything else. I've heard of warriors outbidding healers for rejuvenating gem in GDKPs before for their healing set. They put on their healing set, use their diamond flask, then swap to their real gear and are healing a ton throughout the fight passively. This was genuinely a very good thing to do for very obvious reasons in PvP and certain fights where you took regular damage, such as Sapphiron, Veilstraz, Viscidus, or even Lotheb where the heal kept you topped off made this an incredibly powerful trinket. And the fact that it snapshotted healing whatsoever was just frankly bizarre. In patch notes from vanilla in 1.7, that's the ZG patch, it says all item-based self-heals will no longer be affected by equipment that provides bonuses to healing, and they give examples of Arcanite Champion and Crusader enchants. So fun detected, fun left alone, I suppose. But that's not all you got from this quest, because upon actually handing in at the NPC, he would cast an AoE mega battle shout which affected all nearby units. This lasted a short 15 minutes and was a bonus 400 attack power, which didn't stack with regular battle shout, but it was worth getting if you were going all out. Next one is definitely one of the more obscure ones, and I wonder how many of you guys will remember this. This was an alliance only buff, which of course meant it got nerfed very quickly. Okay, for real though, this would have been the most powerful world buff to ever exist and would have led to some truly insane boss clear times. It was part of the Alliance Onyxia attunement during the jailbreak part of the quest. NPC Marshal Windsor would have a buff called Windsor's Frenzy, which gave 65% attack speed to all nearby friendly units. That is more than double heroism. However, it was supposed to be just an aura for Windsor himself and nearby allies, but for a time it was actually buffing nearby allies instead, so Alliance players had access to a 65% attack speed buff, though it only did last for 10 minutes. It would have allowed for passes like nothing else we've ever seen before, but hey, it didn't last. Soon after, it was patched to work correctly and just buff units near Windsor instead of buffing players, so not too much was ever done with it. One final buff from Classic that was available as part of the Scourge invasion, again stacked with every other buff in the game because why not? Actually, this buff was used for many of the fastest clears of Nax 25 in Wrath of the Lich King Classic because, yeah, everyone kind of forgot about it existing and it still worked in raids. Whoops. It's been nerfed now, by the way. Anyways, Soul Revival is given out in the area nearby after a damaged necrotic shard is destroyed by defeating the nearby Scourge. It takes a while to deplete all of its health, but when it does, it's a huge 10% further boost to your damage, but it only lasts for 30 minutes, so you do have to make the most of it as soon as possible. Now, you'll probably notice that well, everything so far has been from Classic, as in Vanilla Classic, because it was completely degenerate when it came to doing this kind of min-maxing. But there was one discovery made during the Burning Crusade which I distinctly remember, because I used it in raids on my Paladin, and that was Battle Chicken stacking. Okay, so Gnomish Battle Chicken needs 230 engineering to make. It's a 20-minute cooldown trinket that summons a chicken to assist you in combat. Doesn't really do all that much damage or anything, but when it's in combat it has a chance to proc Battle Squawk, giving 5% melee haste for 4 minutes. Now this trinket had been around since Classic, but it was too high RNG on getting the proc to happen, and it was too short duration to make the most out of it. Or was it? Midway through the Burning Crusade, a way to force proc Battle Squawk was discovered. It turns out if your character receives any hostile action and then you pop the trinket, it would consistently send out the buff a few seconds later. Hostile action meaning anything from an enemy, it doesn't matter if you dodge or resist. As long as something happens to your character, the buff should then go out. Best of all, this buff stacked with your group. You could have 4 minutes of 25% extra melee haste. That's only 5% less than Heroism for an entire 4 minutes, which was more than the duration of many boss fights in TBC. And you could swap out the trinket after the buff went out. It didn't even disappear, making this a huge DPS gain. Players would begin to figure out safe ways to proc chickens before fights started, such as keeping one NPC alive which AoEs, or taunting the water elementals in front of Hydros, to name 2. Either way, in a later patch, Blizzard accidentally fixed this interaction. Here's what they had to say about it. With restarts this week, we deployed a hotfix for a bug where Illidan was not respecting the initial cooldown on some of his abilities, such as his phase 5 Enrage. A knock-on effect from this fix is that Battle Squawk from the Gnomish Battle Chicken can no longer bypass its initial cooldown period as it could pre 2.1 WoW. Battle Squawk now observes its correct initial cooldown rules as it did starting in patch 2.1. It was probably for the best that it happened, though it would have made for some new and interesting tactics in the Sunwell on how to best proc your chicken. During Vanilla Classic, players would often go the extra mile to get that extra little bit of DPS, whether it was stacking all the available consumables, collecting all the open world buffs from around Azeroth, or paying your Disc Priest 5 gold per power infusion. The content might have been easy, but that did not stop players from wanting to compete with one another on the DPS meters. And vanilla class design and boss stacking could get really out of control sometimes. Small trinkets from quests, consumables and items that were added into the game because they sounded like a cool idea have come to be relied upon as key pieces to solving puzzles as to how to get the best performance out of your class and specialization that you possibly can. For some classes though, they had to think quite far outside the box or explore ways to play which, well, weren't exactly all that intuitive. In fact, some of the techniques people used are more or less meme-worthy, but still fun to remember. Today I'm going to go over a few more ways that players min-max their characters in Vanilla Classic. Of course, we're starting with Feral Druids. Again, I swear every time I do one of these videos, some kind of weird new tech appears for Feral Druids. I think they're just trying not to play the game normally on purpose at this point. Anyways, back in Classic, Ferals worked a little differently from every other melee class. One of the biggest reasons why is because they didn't attack directly with their weapons, instead their auto attacks were shredding away in cat form or mauling in bear. This meant they couldn't benefit from some of the most powerful buffs or enchants in the game, such as Wind Fury weapon or Crusader. Each of these needed your melee weapon to be hitting directly in order to proc, and you couldn't exactly just drop form and start meleeing in order to proc them. That would just be too much of a DPS loss. But what if there was a way to bypass this requirement, a buff that didn't need you to hit directly with your melee weapon and instead would just proc off any physical damage dealt? Well, fortunately for Ferals, such an item existed. Dragon's Breath Chili. Craftable at 200 cooking, this recipe was sold by vendors across Dustswallow Marsh and Desolace. Eating it will place a 10-minute poison effect on the player, which would give attacks a chance to proc a fire breath type effect in a wide cone in front of you. The proc chance for this is a little bit unclear, but it wouldn't be classic if they just told you how something works now, would it? Wowhead reckons a 5% proc chance with a 10-second internal cooldown, but other comments suggested a lower proc chance and no internal cooldown. Whilst how often this thing procs might be a little bit uncertain, what isn't is the fact that this proc effect effect used to scale 1-to-1 with the caster's spell power, meaning the more spell power that you have, the bigger effect this proc will be. This, of course, meant that, in theory, you could min-max a fire-breathing feral druid DPS specialization, which would actually have access to cleave damage, or alternatively pop the consume on a feral tank for better access to burst threat. In Classic, there were a ton more consumables too, including consumables specifically designed for certain spell schools. If you were going all out, you would be able to pop a flask of supreme power, a greater arcane elixir, and an elixir of greater firepower to buff up your fire feral spec. Now, doing this practically presented several problems, such as the fact that Molten Core and Blackwing Lure are full of mobs which are completely immune to fire damage. Mages were even playing Frost during these tiers. Also, I really hope you like farming gold if you wanted to do this, because wow, these consumables will get expensive. On the positive side, having cleave, especially in dungeons, is very useful. You would 100% pull threat if chili procced on a pull, or maybe it would break a polymorph, or pull mobs that are way in the back because the proc radius is so large. Maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. You also may remember Druid tier gear in Classic just has pretty much every single stat in the game because, I don't know, Druids, they do a bit of everything, right? Just give them a bit of every stat. Playing Fire Feral, you're taking much better advantage of this questionable itemization. Silver linings, right? Other melee classes could do this too, but I just wanted to highlight the ferals here. Speaking of fire, fire mages had an interesting tech back in Classic to min-max their DPS. It was actually an effort that all the fire mages in the raid had to organize among themselves to get the most out of the talent Ignite. Now, in Classic, there was a finite number of debuffs allowed on an enemy mob. This was set to 16. Any debuff that went over that limit would cancel out something else which had already been applied to the mob, and you really didn't want to cancel out your Sunder Armor or your Curse of Recklessness, for example. So if you had two mages spamming Fireball, there would be the small damage over time effect of the Fireball spell itself, and the Ignite damage over time from any crits that they dealt. You can see how this is going to cause problems, as that's a lot of debuff slots for two players. The Fireball dot itself was treated as a minor debuff, however, and it did next to no damage either, so it would be pushed off the debuff table by itself. Ignite, however, was treated as a major debuff, unlike any other passively applied damage over time effect in the game, that is, which more or less meant it's not going to get pushed off the debuff table. However, if each mage was taking up a major debuff slot by playing fire, the spec would kind of just not have been viable. Debuffs are valuable things that help the whole raid after all, not just personal DPS gains. Fortunately, somebody at Blizzard realized this and made an adjustment to Ignite, where all mages share the same Ignite debuff. However, only the first 5 critical strikes applied will determine how much damage this damage over time effect will do. Any of the fire crits after that will only refresh the damage over time instead of modifying it any further. This was called a rolling Ignite. So to start off the fight, you would Scorch to get the fire vulnerability debuff up as soon as possible, cast a few Frostbolts so the weak Ignite effect had time to drop off, and then pop all your trinkets, your cooldowns and so on, and hope to get the biggest fireballs possible. Whichever mage dealt the first crit would also claim the Ignite for the purposes of the DPS meters, meaning on some fights, such as Chrome Magus with good RNG, mages could do more than TBC levels of DPS. I always like to think of rolling Ignite as all the mages are building a big bonfire together and then maintaining it with crits. A quick one that I remember people also doing in Blackwing Lure was a tactic that anybody could use on Veilstraz. One of the mechanics in the encounter was burning adrenaline. This will place a debuff on a target, increasing damage done and reducing cast time by 100%. However, after a short duration, you would explode, instantly dying and taking anybody nearby with you. And in Classic, there were also whirl buffs in the raid, so going to all that preparation to get them and then getting the bomb on Veil was pretty annoying. It is an unavoidable death mechanic after all, or is it? Well, it turns out that 100% cast time reduction worked on any cast. including Hearthstone. You hearthed out before the debuff timer hit 0, and it would remove that debuff from you instantly, keeping you alive and keeping your world buffs active. After a certain incident involving Zul'Gurub and a blood plague, Blizzard became a little more wary of allowing debuffs to be taken outside of raid, so let's just say that. After that, you'd have to be summoned back outside the entrance portal of Blackwing Lair and then rejoin your raid, but at least you'd still have all your world buffs running. Next we have a hunter trick to optimize DPS. This started off in Classic, but it didn't become super popular until late the Burning Crusade. It's called melee weaving. So to this day in Wrath of the Lich King, there's a minimum range the hunter must stand from the target in order to be able to attack them with ranged attacks. In Wrath, it's 5 yards, even though when you're fighting any dragon boss, it feels more like 25. But back in vanilla, it was 8 yards. However, one big difference is that the swing timers for melee and ranged attacks were tracked separately. This means you could fire off a shot from your bow at 8 yards, run inside the 5-yard range, land a melee attack with your weapon, run back out to 8 yards, and your swing timer would be coming up again on your bow. Rinse and repeat, and that is a melee weave. This was done to min-max the 2 different swing timers and would lead to higher DPS than regular play, at much greater effort and much greater margin for error. In TBC, the minimum distance for ranged attacks was moved down from 8 yards to 5. Yes, melee is also 5 yards too. Technically, there's a very small difference between the two. This meant the process of a successful melee weave could be achieved with a lot less movement. On top of that, both factions now had access to Wind Fury on a big 2-handed weapon, which also added a nice extra bit of DPS. Looking at all the top logs for Brutalis, the big patchwork fight to the Sunwell, it's all BM hunters melee weaving. Moving into Wrath, Blizzard made a change where melee and ranged weapons swing timers now share the same cooldown, effectively stopping this from being a viable way to gain DPS overnight. Finally, I'm going to try and explain something which I'm pretty sure I still don't even understand. Weapon skill scaling in Classic WoW. So weapon skill, you all know what it is. You get a nice big upgrade, you go enchant it, gem it, put it on, hit something, and then get a message in your chat saying your skill in maces is now 14 and feel very bad. It's still a thing in Wrath and was in TBC, and in these expansions it's kind of just a number you need to get maxed out to be dealing the most effective damage with whatever type of weapon it is you're using. There used to be a ton more importance tied to your weapon skill, and it wasn't until a later patch in TBC when expertise was introduced as a stat that weapon skill got relegated to a semi-forgettable thing you just need to max out. Expertise, of course, affecting the chance for your attacks to be dodged or parried, making it an important stat alongside hit. Back in Classic, it was a whole other ball game. Weapon skill was so important and so rarely available on items that it made a level 44 pair of male bind on equipped gloves best in slot for warriors for near the entire game. Why though? Well, in very simple term, weapon skill on items could take you beyond the weapon skill cap, and the benefit from weapon skill continued to scale beyond the cap too. It was like the difference between attacking a mob that's 3 or more levels above you, where their level shows as orange, and a mob that's within 2 levels of you, where their level shows as yellow. To go in depth a little bit more, weapon skill is normally capped out at 300, and in vanilla it affected the chance for your attacks to be dodged, parried, blocked, but also importantly impacted your hit chance as well as glancing blows. What's a glancing blow though? Well, against an enemy that's a higher level than you, you'll have a chance to land a glancing blow. Against a level 63, for example, which is the level that all raid bosses would have been with 300 weapon skill, your attacks would have a 40% chance to be a glancing blow. When that happens, they deal 65% of their regular damage, which is a pretty big hit to your DPS. But what if we got our weapon skill above what is the normal cap? Well, with the likes of Edge Masters, the human ratio for swords, or axes for orcs, you could do exactly that. Going up to 305 weapon skill caused you to be able to overcome the built-in 1% miss chance on all attacks in the game too. Here's a short little message from a blue post on this. They say there is some code in 1.12 that explicitly adds a modifier that causes the first 1% of hit gained from talents or gear to be ignored against monsters with more than 10 defense skill above above the attacking player's weapon skill. This means the so-called hit cap is in effect 9% rather than 8% for a player with 300 weapon skill fighting a level 63 monster with a defense skill of 315. With a weapon skill of 305 from sword spec from humans or axe spec from orcs, this hit modifier is no longer in place against monsters 3 or more levels above you, provided you're using the correct weapon type, that is. This makes weapon skill very good against raid level monsters. As for glancing blows, when at 300 weapon skill they were a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 65% of normal damage. At 305 weapon skill, this was changed to a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 85% of normal damage. So all in all, these gloves, or getting to 305 weapon skill, allowed you to overcome the base 1% miss chance and reduce the effect of glancing blows by 20%. You can see why items such as Edge Masters fetch such a high price, or alternatively you could just roll human and orc and save yourself a few thousand gold and get this racial bonus for free. All in all, there were so many ways to min-max your character in Classic. The gameplay might have been simple, the bosses might have been easy, but to actually understand how and why everything worked the way it did does get very complicated when you start to look into it. I mean, even during Classic, a near 20-year-old game at this point, players were still trying to fully uncover exactly how everything works. And on TBC servers that are now in Wrath, we're still discovering new min-maxes, new techniques, new talent builds, and so on. It's definitely one of the more interesting areas to cover in videos, and proves that even a game this old, that many think is super solved, can still throw out the odd surprise now and again. Was there anything else from Classic you think is worth a mention? Drop it down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.